During the allotment period, the Cherokee Nation was actually terminated. The government was terminated, and there were some things left open, and they'll tell you that they were still existent. But as a government, there was no governmental functions that were happening after the allotment and after statehood. There was no such entity as the Cherokee Nation. They had been terminated in 1906, just prior to statehood, which was in 1907. But in 1905, just prior to the termination of the Cherokee government, the Keetoowahs went to the federal court and got a certificate of incorporation for the Keetoowah Society. Now this gave them standing in the courts, and what the Keetoowahs said was that if the Cherokee government is terminated, who will represent us in our land issues, because we know that we will have land issues. We have our land. They gave us a piece of paper, said this land belongs to you. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there won't be people there trying to take it. And of course that was true. And so they did have to go to courts. And this certificate of incorporation for the Keetoowahs gave them the standing in the courts. It gave them the right to fight the battles in the courts. And at this time, the Keetoowahs were the only ones that were fighting those battles. Now, our attorney was Frank J. Boudinot. He represented the Keetoowahs, he represented the Cherokees, the Delawares, the Shawnees, and various other tribes during the allotment time, and then after the allotment time in the courts of claim of the federal government. And he was very active in seeking justice for the people. He saw and he knew how that they had been taken advantage of by various people and by the government, the U.S. government itself. So Frank was born at the end of the Civil War in 1866. And he grew up, became an attorney, and he saw that as his life's work, and indeed it was his life's work. He represented the Keetoowahs and various other tribes from 1898 until 1945 when he passed away. He spent his whole career working for the Indian tribes to help them recover at least monetary remuneration for their losses. He was, to us, he was a hero, because he fought those battles on our behalf. And then when the reorganization period came about in 1934, the U.S. government, of course that was during the Great Depression, and the U.S. government with Franklin Delano Roosevelt as the president, Roosevelt said, well, you know, the native people of this country are the poorest of the poor, even during that Great Depression where everybody, except the very rich, were poor. And they were struggling and having a hard time trying to get by. And he said, well, we know that the native people are the poorest of the poor, and maybe if we give them their governments back, they can help themselves better than we can help them. And so that's what they did. In 1934, they passed an act called the Indian Reorganization Act, which addressed actually the tribes that had reservations. And after the allotment period, there were no reservations in Oklahoma. They said, recently we've heard different, but we thought at that time there were no reservations left in Oklahoma. And so they wrote a different act and passed it in Congress for the purposes of Oklahoma natives who did not have reservations. And the Keetoowahs immediately began to try to get the tribe back together and to find a way to help their people. And that's what it was all about, helping the people. The Cherokee Nation at that time didn't see any reason to reorganize their government, and so they did not. And actually they did not reorganize their government, and it still has not been reorganized. They wrote a new constitution in 1976, which was voted on by a few of the Cherokee people, and that's what they functioned on for several years. In fact, just this year, they had their new constitution approved. For a long time, the BIA would not approve their constitution, the new constitution that they wrote in 1999, and they had their people vote on it, and they ratified it, but the government, the U.S. government, would not approve it. And they said, well, we don't need the government's approval. Well, the government said, oh, yes, you do. Yes, you do. And so the government would not approve it until just this year, actually, the BIA, Deb Haaland, the new Secretary of the Interior, approved it. So there was no Cherokee government as a functioning body for many years, even back into the 60s. I remember, I'm old enough to remember the 60s very well, and there was no Cherokee government. There was no place to say that we have this as our Cherokee building. Now, when the money for Indian tribes began to come down, that's when they woke up and decided, hey, we need to get our act together and start functioning so that we can get some of that money. That was their thought, I'm sure, although they probably would deny it. They got themselves together and had voted on a chief in 1972. In 1970, October 22nd, 1970, the Congress passed a bill that gave the Cherokees, the Choctaw, Seminoles, Creeks, and those 5 tribes, gave them the right to again select a chief. It does not say elect, it says select. And so they did. They began getting themselves together. And then as they began to get themselves together, they began to pressure the Keetoowahs to put us down. Actually, their first building they had out here, where they are located now, the money for that building came down through the Keetoowahs, because at that time, the Cherokees did not have a government-to-government relationship with the U.S. government, and that's what the U.S. government said. The Keetoowahs do. They are reorganized. The Cherokee Nation does not. And so the money for that building came down through the Keetoowahs from the U.S. government. And the building that they built, the Keetoowahs had offices in there, and the BIA had an office in there, and they paid rent to the Keetoowahs for that office. And so then when Ross Swimmer came in, I'm just giving you the whole load here. When Ross Swimmer came in, he kicked the Keetoowahs out, moved their furniture and everything out on the lawn, and said, we don't need you guys around here anymore. And so Chief Glory, Bill Glory, who was the Keetoowah chief at that time, called John here and said, John, come down here and help me move this furniture and all these files and things, because they have kicked us out. And so John came, brought his truck, and hauled stuff to Chief Glory's house. And so that's how the separation came between the Cherokee Nation and the Keetoowahs. And again, there are many, many, many more Cherokees than there are Keetoowahs. We have a 1/4 blood degree requirement. Cherokee Nation has no requirement at all for blood. And so that's why we are looked upon, and I've heard many people say this, the Keetoowahs, oh, yeah, I've heard of you. You're the real Cherokees. And so that's kind of the name that we have been given by outsiders, is that we are the real Cherokees. You know, we kind of took up on that ourselves. We have this sweatshirt that says, Keetoowah, the real thing. And there are lots of people that agree with that. But anyway, we do appreciate what Unethlanahi has given us, that we are still a united Keetoowah band, that we are Keetoowah by birth and united by blood. That's what our newest t-shirt says. And we're very honored and pleased that we have been able to keep ourselves going with the help of Almighty God. And we appreciate all the people who came before us, all of our ancestors. I could name them, I could name lots of them that have come before us that kind of helped us together and helped us to move along, and they all deserve some credit. All of our chiefs, all of our councils, all of those people who sacrificed over the years to keep us together, they all deserve credit, and we appreciate them so much, including our current council and our current chief. We appreciate them all. And if you have a chance to come to the John Hare Cultural Center and Museum, please do. We'd be very happy to see you, whether you're Keetoowah or Cherokee or Shawnee or white or whatever. We welcome all people here to view what we have achieved here with our museum.